like you.
Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. But Shakespeare left out a fourth category. Some are not great at all. According to Robert Shogan, all 9 presidents of the United States since Franklin Roosevelt belong in this last category. Mr. Shogan, who is national political correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, assesses these 9 presidencies in his new book, The Riddle of Power, Presidential Leadership from Truman to Bush. He measures them by 3 variables he says are central to the definition of greatness: ideology, values, and character. And he finds them all wanting in various degrees, although it may be too early for a final judgment on the incumbent. Mr. Shogan has merely been covering national politics for 3 decades, so his observations on Truman and Eisenhower are necessarily secondhand. But he draws on personal experience and anecdotes in his assessments of Kennedy, Bush, and those other guys in between. Clearly, American citizens do need some help in evaluating their presidents and presidential candidates, since these gentlemen themselves make evaluation difficult. Election campaigns, which are supposed to be the occasion for judgment, are unhelpful, to say the least. George Bush's 1988 campaign was all about flags and prison furloughs. It told you nothing about either his strengths or his weaknesses as a president. Mr. Buckley, before we get to the Shogun 9, maybe we should clear up some underbrush. At this late date, are you prepared to concede that Franklin Roosevelt was a great president?
Yeah, I certainly am, in the sense that Caesar and Alexander and Napoleon were all great and all highly to be feared. As, you know, any man who simply who has the raw appeal in a democratic situation to set precedents, get elected 4 times, get elected when even after his doctors have told me he can only work an hour and a half a day. Thank God, if he had worked 8 hours a day, we would have lost all of Europe. But that wasn't the point you stressed, actually, in your evaluation of us.
That may have been the key to the Reagan presidency. He may have taken that lesson to heart. He only worked an hour and a half a day.
Well, yeah, Mencken said that was the greatest thing about Harding and Cleveland, the long naps they took. But actually, Michael's pointed to an interesting point here, however inadvertently, which is that, and a point that you stressed, there's so much for a president to do that almost by definition he can't be a good president if by being a good president you say, here are the things that Congress has given him to do, an accumulation that began in 1780, which includes setting the price of soybeans this morning. He simply can't do it. The very first thing that Hoover did when he came into the White House, I will now sound like you because he told me this, was to find out that he had to sign 360 times a day a typical document. So he invented a machine, which he had in his suite in the Waldorf Towers, that used a pen and signed 3 things at a time and got Congress to authorize that as a presidential signature. Now, even then, in 1928, it seemed to be saying that there was so much that had to be done that no president could really give it the kind of attention that's implied by, in a deliberative chief executive. Would you go along with that?
Well, I don't think there's enough time to do all the things that they might do. I guess what I tried to do in the book was to judge them or assess what they did in terms of what I thought were major challenges.
3 values, yeah.
Facing, well, that's right, but the 3 values were an explanation of how they did. What I talked about is the challenges facing us as a country. I use greatness in the sense not so much of good or bad, but greatness in terms of the impact they have on our lives.
Yeah, in that sense I answered
just as you were saying about
Kinsley,
Franklin Roosevelt. So, for example, in the case of Eisenhower, the challenge that I chose to deal with, and it was one of the central ones facing him, although I don't know he felt that way, was the challenge of civil rights, and which I felt that he tried to avoid dealing with and tried to put off. He wasn't, because of his ideology or lack of it, he wasn't really, he was uncomfortable dealing with the kind of controversy, the clash of ideas that civil rights represented. He tried to think of it in other terms. Eisenhower's approach to leadership was governed, as many of the other presidents, by his origins and his background, by his military approach. What I tried to suggest was that the ability of a president to use the power of his office, which is a potential, depends on how these three traits, ideology, values, and character, blend together. There is no magic bullet for each one of them. Rather, it's the combination, the melding of them, that can make them successful in specific cases. Reagan was an example. His ideology, the feeling that, that freedom is the greatest good and government is its enemy, his values for his respect for the American past, and his kind of personality, which took so much of the sting out of his rhetoric, all that worked up to a point to help him accomplish things and deal with what, it wasn't some arbitrarism, what most Americans felt was a very grave challenge, which was the state of the economy when he took office.
Let's clarify what you mean when you use the word ideology. Because,
that's a good question, and that needs clarification, particularly in this country, because, one thing, most Americans think ideology is kind of a dirty word, certainly a foreign word, and there are very few politicians who will ever admit to being, none of them will ever admit to being an ideologue, or ideological at all. We all remember Michael Dukakis saying, this election isn't about ideology, it's about competence. Well, I mean, he might have had a point, of course, if he had been a little bit more competent, but he was short on both things. But in fact, people do have ideologies in the sense that, I mean, ideology, or they should have, anyhow, they need it for effective leadership. It's a framework of political belief, of philosophy, a way of judging, a standard, a frame of reference for looking at what's going on in the country. Now, often, because of the public aversion to anything that might be called political philosophy, ideology becomes more of a strategy, in my terms, than just a set of beliefs. For instance, Nixon, who stood for middle-class values and beliefs and tried to represent those interests, his ideology consisted, to a large extent, of a strategy of lining up the middle class on one side and its opposition on the other. This was how he built support.
A political strategy, and you're not talking about political
That's right, but that's what ideology, I mean, in effect, that's about as much ideology as you get in this country. It was political. I use ideology to mean political as opposed to values which are moral and standard, and character which has to do with persona.
Here is the problem I think we should acknowledge with that word. And that is that the word ideology, in addition to meaning that framework you referred to, also means the non-rational, i.e. anti-philosophical application of ideas a prioristically.
Well,
so for instance, when you say he ideologized that proposal, it's almost always said to the disadvantage of the person who does it.
Right.
So there you're leaning on one use of the word ideology as distinguished from the one that you lean on.
Nowhere in my book, Mr. will you find ideology used as a verb. And in fact, I try, although it's other people do, and they use it in that context, I try to explain it in a different
simply
sense.
A cluster of ideas.
Yeah, it's exactly, in a frame of reference, and often actually it consists both of a means and an end. The end are the goals of what your political beliefs are, and the means are really how you get about it. And they're tied together in this country. They have to be, or you don't get anything done.
Now, when you get to George Bush, and of course you went to press before the Gulf Storm business, you think of him as essentially a footloose in respect to these points.
Unformed. I think his ideology has been blurred. As I said, these attitudes...
Unformed in the sense of stillborn or in the sense of gestating?
Well, we don't know yet, do we? I mean, that's a big question. I mean, one hopes that it's gestating and developing, but what we can see so far is that it's been greatly blurred by he has roots in two different forests. One is in the Northeast, where his father, whom you probably, I didn't tell you about Connecticut, Prescott Bush, was a distinguished representative of the Northeastern Republican establishment. It meant something and had some power. Then Bush himself considers himself a Texan and has some roots and some inclinations toward that school, that sort of neo-populist school of Republican. Bush goes around saying, well, I am a conservative. Well, who in the Republican Party isn't? The question is, what kind of a conservative? We don't know that. And what he does, as we find people often do when their own mind views aren't set, is he tries to avoid the question And instead of ideology, or instead of working out, and I mean in a very broad sense, instead of working out as policy, I mean, I use ideology and policy almost synonymously. Instead of developing strong policies, he tends to lean on other factors. For example, in dealing with the Mideast crisis, Bush was commended, I think justly so, for creating this alliance. This was his outstanding contribution, building this coalition, in which we finally got Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, although that apparently hasn't ended our problems, has it? Yet, this was built around what I consider his values, which is his strength in personal relationships. He had developed that as a child, going out of his family. Bush is an example of the extended family and the strength of it, from his family to the places he worked, to the CIA, to the Republican Party, eventually to all these world leaders. He elevated networking to kind of a global art during the time of the crisis.
Well, but now, let's pause for a moment, because isn't it a question of the challenge of the times whether you need a leader or simply somebody who is a sort of a distillery of ideas and patches them together in such a way as to make apparently irreconcilable reconciled,
Well,
and then writes policy on that basis?
Well, I think you're saying whether we need an originator or a synthesizer. We always need a leader.
Yeah.
But you can lead and develop a philosophy that would represent what I think you're suggesting.
Yeah, sort of a plebiscitarian. You say in here that LBJ was a consensual president.
Yes.
He was for consensuses, and therefore he couldn't understand people who would sort of stand out in front and be confrontational.
That's right.
Because of that, there was that uneasy relationship between him and the Kennedys.
Well, there's an uneasy relationship that pervaded his presidency. He didn't want to. I think politics is about disagreement and argument. I think that's healthy because we have a system for doing it peacefully and civilly through this process and through the Constitution we've set up. What Johnson tried to do was to pretend that there was no disagreement. He pretended that there was just a common agreement on nearly everything. Now, if you're doing that, you're fooling people. It's a big con job. He wanted to do that because he didn't want to have to explain himself. Most presidents I've found, and most politicians, they're like grown-ups in the children in the family. They say, well, just do this and it's right, take my word for it. Like Bush said, well, I'll get him out of Kuwait, just watch and wait. I don't want to answer any questions. I don't think citizens of this country should be treated like children. I think that they're citizens. I think presidents should be accountable to them. I think part of being accountable is acknowledging that there are choices and that there are disagreements, and saying, look, I want to do this, and this kind of policy is going to cost something.
Who has most recently failed in that respect?
Who has most recently failed? Well, I don't think that Bush, for example, has very clearly sketched before or during or after, if you consider yourself after Desert Storm, I guess we are, really all the consequences of what was involved in that policy. I don't think prior to the invasion of Kuwait, I think his attempts to, I think there was sort of a half, I think we had sort of one eye cocked part of the time on the Gulf region, and our idea was to use Saddam Hussein as a counter against Iran. Turned out that didn't work. We got involved in a war there. I mean, it was pretty clearly that this president wanted the war. Whether or not there was another way to solve it, we'll never know. But
wait a minute. You're dealing in a level of subtleties that we haven't heard since Woodrow Wilson or Abraham Lincoln. You're talking about an article of foreign affairs, not a fireside chat.
No,
fireside chats are not exercises in subtlety.
Well, no, I don't think it's terribly subtle to say to explain to the American people that if you're asking them to go into war, what the purposes were and what the costs might be. I mean, this was a war that we engaged in with a very limited purpose, in which we were determined it was a war that was not supposed to have any loss or sacrifice involved, because there was apparently a feeling you couldn't get public support to sustain any losses or sacrifices. There was no need for anybody to. We disrupted lives, but we didn't go beyond that. And
you're losing me. I never remember a situation in which he said, let's send 500,000 people to Saudi Arabia and make certain that nobody gets hurt.
No, I didn't, but I think it was implicit of course he didn't do that, but that was implicit in the way the war was carried out, and the desire to avoid casualties. I'm grateful about that we didn't need to have any casualties.
Well, to minimize casualties.
Well, of course, we always try to do that. What I guess I'm speaking to more than the amount of casualties, which no one wants to incur, is that we wanted to minimize the risk and involvement of this country, which is why we're in sort of the contradictory situation we're in now, where having taken the high moral ground in forcing...
it may be forfeit after our failure.
That's right, and now that has tarnished it. So it's not, this goes back to the original reason of why we were fighting the war. If Bush had said, we're fighting the war because simply because it's a serious threat to our economic interests because of the oil, that's a valid reason for doing it. He should have explained to the people and asked them to do that. I think he was concerned that that would appear crass and mercenary, and people might not be willing to make the sacrifice. He cast it on moral grounds, but the moral obligation, I think many people would argue, would, if you were going to take the moral ground, would follow through to,
Wilsonianism, yeah.
Yeah, well, I would but it would certainly not allow what's happening to the Kurds and to the others.
Well, let me ask you a couple of specific points. Here you come out with evaluations for the last nine presidents.
Well, 8 plus.
And 8 presidents, and there's certain characterizations you make that tend to surprise. For instance, you think that Johnson was an unsuccessful president, and you think Reagan was a successful president, though it's clear that your own inclinations are Democratic rather than Republican.
Well, I would say that, but...
Yeah. But now tell me, why was Johnson an unsuccessful
Well, first of all, let me clarify. Johnson had successes and Reagan had failures. What I tried to do in the book was not rate the presidents in that kind of order as, some historians have done and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, who was best. What I tried to do, and what I'm interested in doing, what I think would be valuable, is that since the presidency affects all our lives greatly, is to understand what are the factors that allow presidents to succeed in certain situations, and what keeps, and what inhibits success or works against it. So I showed how Reagan, in dealing with the economic problems, was able to succeed because of his ideology, politics, and value. This is why I call this the riddle of power. Well, but Johnson, because of his weaknesses in those characteristics, was unable to deal with, I think most people would agree, was a fundamental challenge of his president, the effort to reconcile Vietnam and the Great Society. And he couldn't do that, and he tried to carry them both on. He tried to carry the war on, and without cutting back the Great Society. Johnson did not go to the country and say, look, this is a major... He didn't go to the country and say, look, we can afford to get out of Vietnam. I know we've been there, but we can survive. This country is so powerful, it's not going to be seriously damaged by having, part of Indochina.
Well, how would he handle his sacred commitment?
Or, wait a minute, or he could have said, look, this war in Indochina is so important that we've got to prosecute it, and therefore I've got to cut back on all the things we've been doing domestically. We've got to pay more taxes. There aren't enough resources for us to wage this war successfully and to a conclusion, to be fair to our fighting men, and to do that and still carry on the domestic program. Well, he could do one or the other.
It seems to me that what he ended up doing was spending much more money than he would have spent if he had reached out for more conclusive war.
Well, that's right, but he didn't understand it.
He might have won about 1967.
Well, he could have, but he didn't want to admit it. Look at he kept saying we can do both.
He didn't want to risk war with China.
No, he didn't want to risk war with China, but he didn't want to risk the Great Society either. Yeah. He tried to carry them both on. He didn't want to make that choice.
But when you use the word ideology in respect of Reagan,
yes.
And yet that ideology sets forth certain propositions and certain priorities with which you as a voter are out of sympathy, and yet you assign to his ideology a cause of its success. Is it simply because it made him a coherent president?
That's a large part of it. I think what presidents succeed, it doesn't really have much to do with my sympathies as a voter. I was trying to look at it objectively from what most people, I was trying to understand it or describe it from in terms of how the country looked on it. I think most people felt the economy was in terrible shape when Reagan took over as president. I think most people wanted some kind of solution. Reagan propounded an answer and was able to, and had established goals that were fairly clear up to a point, and was able to mobilize support for them by enunciating those goals. And what made it successful was people were convinced that he believed in what he was saying. And he did, up to a point.
You made it politically successful.
Well, that's
because
what, well,
if he thought that 2 and 2 made 5, no matter how sincerely he believed it, he couldn't possibly have, quote, succeeded.
well, he succeeded to this degree. Okay, succeeded in the first step was in getting the program through. That's the first step of success. Then he succeeded, I think many Republicans would argue, in that the program did contribute to an economic recovery. Where he didn't succeed is a result of the limitations of his ideology, and that's the obverse side of its strength. It was one of the things that made it so persuasive and convincing was that it was homemade. It was Reagan's own beliefs that he pretty well fashioned out for himself. But there were shortcomings, and obviously Reagan didn't foresee or chose not to foresee what all the implications of it were. When he said, when he said that he could balance the budget, raise defense spending, and cut taxes and still balance the budget, I think that he probably believed that. He may have. Now,
and not get in the way of entitlement.
That's right. Well, that was the key, because David Stockman said to him, if you want to do this, you got to cut the entitlement. Well, that was where that was where the shortcomings of Reagan. So none of these guys are perfect. None of these guys are devil. I don't argue that in the book. What I try and show is how these things can work up to a point, and how, if there are limitations of them, they don't work. Because Reagan's ideology wasn't fully developed, or because of perhaps partly of his personality, he didn't want to accept the idea that he had to cut entitlement. And he wound up with what Stockman called a half a revolution. I mean, that's why the book is called The Riddle of Power, Bill, is because it isn't that easy.
So how can you fully round out an ideology without becoming an ideologue? I mean, Marx gave us an ideology which was completely rounded out. It took you.
It may not have been.
It took you right to redemption. It had a beginning and an eschatology, but of course it was phony.
Well, it seems not to. Yeah,
but it really isn't part of the conservative talents to round out an ideology. We don't believe in ideology.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
It's not a part of conservative responsibility to round out an ideology, because we don't presume to follow the implications of certain actions beyond a certain point, because if we did, we would be making a concession to the central intelligence alternative to the marketplace that suggested we would know what the reaction of the marketplace would be to certain alternatives.
Well, I think this is your view of the presidency, and it's a view I'd be interested in seeing exercised sometime. I don't think Ronald Reagan...
It's my view of conservative doctrine.
Well, I know, but I think Ronald Reagan's view was somewhat different from that, as near as I can understand. I think he professed to feel, or gave us the impression, I don't know if he was totally a great faker, or maybe...
But that
he was articulating was sufficient until the responsibilities. I think he acted, I think he believed in those things, and he didn't want to recognize the inconsistency and contradiction.
What did you mean by this sentence? The painful fact is, this is in your chapter on Reagan, you're quoting Reagan, the painful fact is we can only limit inflation by undergoing a period of economic dislocation. This was before 81. A recession, if you will, Reagan said. This is you. That contention turned out to be all too true, as Reagan's presidency unfortunately demonstrated. What do you mean, unfortunately demonstrated?
Well, I think unfortunately, in that it was unfortunate for 10 million people.
Was the demonstration unfortunate?
Who was out of work. I think it was out of work. I think it was unfortunate. No, I think it was unfortunate for the people who were out of work and lost jobs and suffered.
Wait a minute. I want to understand you. If I say, Mr. Shogan, you can't lose 10 pounds without eating less, and 3 months later, would some of you entitled to say, unfortunately, Mr. Buckley proved to be correct?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't.
I didn't.
I guess. Well, if I write a book with that sentence in, then you can ask me about it. That's not what I said.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Let me ask you, Mr. Buckley. It seems to me the test of great leadership is a simple one. Are you willing and are you able to lead people where they don't want to go? By that test, at least, Margaret Thatcher, for example, was a great conservative leader. Ronald Reagan was not. He never let his ideology get in the way of his popularity. And the reason, for example, he didn't cut entitlements was not that he recognized in the same sophisticated way you do the tragic limits of conservative ideology. He just didn't want it to affect his poll numbers. He wouldn't sacrifice popularity for ideology, and he never led people where they didn't want to go, never delivered bad news, and never urged sacrifice for the greater good. And to me, that means he wasn't a great leader. I wonder what you think of that.
Well, I think it's a good try. The point about a great leader is, of course, that he can recognize that inchoately people want to go in a particular direction, but they figure that there are too many obstacles to going there, and so he tries to remove the obstacles. In the Soviet Union, in Russia,
give me an example of Ronald Reagan ever doing. That's a very good definition. When did Ronald Reagan ever do anything like that?
Well,
as Margaret Thatcher did, clearly.
Well, in California, he persuaded the Assembly to insist that people who receive welfare checks work. And he, that, by the way, 10 years later became a part of the Democratic doctrine also.
Not a terribly courageous or unpopular thing to say.
It's interesting you should say that in a season in which everybody's blaming Reagan for having cut so many programs that are aimed at the homeless and the unemployed as to leave
Sure, but did he ever cut the middle class programs, the ones that really hurt? Did he ever say to people, as David Stockman said he would have to, as Bob Shogan just pointed out, if you want to bring the government under control, if you want to have less government, it's going to cost you. It's up to you. That's precisely what he never did, and that's why he never got it under control, wouldn't you agree?
Well, no, it is true that for a brief period he was struck by the theologians of supply side who insisted that more money would come in than that which you cut. Reagan didn't predict that, but he did predict that much more money would come in as you cut, and that was absolutely correct. That is to say, 500% as many capital gains taxes were being paid in 1984 as 1978. We've been told to, we're through. Thank you so much, Mr. Shogan, author of Little Power, Michael Kinsley, and ladies and gentlemen of the Harvard Republican Club.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you.